It is the morning of August 7th, 1944, and the hill is already on fire. Not from explosions, not yet, but from the particular August light that burns off the Norman fog around 5 in the morning, turning every exposed stone face on Hill 314 a deep copper orange. Lieutenant Robert Weiss, a 22-year-old forward artillery observer attached to the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, is lying face down in a shallow foxhole near the eastern crest of the hill. He is pressing his left cheek into French soil that smells of crushed grass and old rain. In his right hand, he holds a radio handset connected to a Skier R-300 transceiver, an 18-pound backpack radio that has been running for 3 hours straight. Beside him, within arm's reach, Lieutenant Charles Bartz occupies a foxhole roughly the diameter of a bathtub. Both men have been awake since midnight. Below them, in the dark valley to the east, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, is moving. They can hear it before they can see it. The particular grinding of German tank tracks on a French country road is not like the American sound. It is heavier, more deliberate, a sound that carries a confidence in its own weight. Then the noise multiplies. Then another sound joins it from the north, the 2nd Panzer Division, Wehrmacht, moving on a separate axis. And somewhere behind both columns, the 1st SS Panzer Division is also in motion. Adolf Hitler has personally ordered this counterattack. He has named it Operation Lüttich. He believes it will cut the American supply corridor at Avranches, isolate Patton's Third Army in Brittany, and reverse the entire Allied breakout from Normandy in a single night. Around Hill 314, the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, roughly 700 men in total, has just relieved a unit from the 1st Infantry Division. They were told the sector was quiet. One officer had said, the previous afternoon, that Mortain would be an excellent place for a little rest and recreation. That officer's exact words would be remembered by the survivors as a particular kind of cruel irony. By 2 in the morning, Das Reich Infantry is inside the town of Mortain, below the hill, kicking in doors, clearing cellars, moving through streets in coal scuttle helmets. The 2nd Battalion's command post at the Étal de la Poste has been overrun. The battalion commander himself will be captured before sunrise. Weiss and Bartz, cut off, surrounded by SS Panzer Grenadiers, 6 miles from the nearest American line and encircled on 4 sides by armor and infantry, face a problem that has no visible solution in that moment. They have a radio. They have maps. They have line of sight to the valley roads below them. They have the call signs and frequencies of every artillery battalion within range. But the German columns have already disappeared into the hedgerows at the base of the hill, swallowed by the bocage, invisible from the air. In 30 minutes, with full daylight, the largest German armored counterattack in the Western Theater since D-Day will either succeed or fail. And the only thing standing between success and failure is the question of whether 2 American lieutenants on a hilltop can locate, identify, and kill targets that a superior enemy with better tanks and more men has spent the night carefully hiding. Not a question of courage. The courage is assumed. The question is communication. The question is whether an American system, not a piece of equipment, not a weapon, but a system of trust between a lieutenant and a sergeant and a gunner and a battery commander, is equal to what the German army had spent 30 years building. In 4 hours, the answer will be unmistakable. In 6 days, when relief troops finally reach the crest of Hill 314, the German offensive will have cost Hitler 4 panzer divisions, 120 tanks and assault guns, and any realistic hope of holding France. And the most important weapon in that outcome will not be a tank, not an aircraft, not an artillery piece. It will be a radio handset in the right hand of a 22-year-old lieutenant who had not been given a current map. Within hours, one forward observer with a radio and the authority to make his own decisions will do what 4 German Panzer divisions cannot. He will not ask permission. He will not wait for confirmation from a superior officer. He will pick up the handset, identify the target, and call the fire. The system had been designed, argued over, revised, and resisted for 20 years. Here, in the stones above Mortain, it either works or it doesn't. If this story matters to you, if you believe the men who held that hill in August 1944 deserve something more than a footnote, take 10 seconds and hit the subscribe button below this video. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Every subscriber tells us that this kind of history is worth telling. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. To understand why German officers never understood how Americans found them, you have to understand what finding the enemy actually meant in Normandy in the summer of 1944. It meant something specific. It meant knowing, in real time, where a German tank was hidden behind a hedgerow, a bank of earth 4 to 16 feet high, matted with decades of roots, covered in brush so dense that you could not see through it from 10 feet away. It meant not just knowing the tank was there, but being able to direct artillery fire onto it accurately enough to destroy it. And it meant doing all of that in under 5 minutes, because German tank crews understood that stationary tanks were dead tanks, and they did not stay in one position once they believed they had been spotted. The bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, covers roughly 3,000 square miles of the Cotentin Peninsula and its surroundings. A single square mile of this terrain contains several hundred hedgerow enclosures, each one essentially a walled field, averaging perhaps 90 feet across. The hedgerows were not casual farm fences. They were ancient earthworks, some of them built by the Romans, some of them 4 to 5 feet of solid compacted soil topped by root systems so deep and interlocked that a Sherman tank attempting to climb over one would expose its soft belly armor and stall with its gun pointing at the sky. An M4 Sherman weighing 33 tons was, in the bocage, effectively channeled into single-file movement down country lanes that German anti-tank gunners had pre-registered with their 75 EME PaK-40s at ranges of less than 300 yards. The official American doctrine for dealing with this problem was combined arms coordination, which existed in training manuals and had been the subject of serious tactical thought going back to the interwar years. Infantry and armor and artillery would work together, each covering the weaknesses of the others. Tanks would provide firepower and shock. Infantry would protect the tanks from close-range infantry threats. Artillery would suppress and destroy positions that neither tanks nor infantry could approach directly. The doctrine was sensible. It was well-reasoned. It had worked in exercises. It had one serious problem. It was built around the assumption that infantrymen and tankers could talk to each other. In Normandy, in June and July of 1944, they could not. Not reliably. Not quickly enough to matter. The infantry platoon's primary radio was the Skrar 300 backpack transceiver, a Motorola-designed FM set weighing roughly 38 pounds with battery, operating on the VHF band between 40 and 48 megahertz. The Sherman tank's primary radio was the Skrar 508 or Skrar 528, also FM but operating in a different frequency range and designed for tank-to-tank communication within an armored unit's net. The two systems were not interoperable. An infantry commander's Skrar 300 could not reach a tanker's Skrar 508 any more than a CB radio can reach a police dispatcher. They occupied different slices of the spectrum, and the hardware was built around the internal needs of each branch, not around the need to connect the branches to each other. But the problem ran deeper than frequency incompatibility. A tanker buttoned up inside his Sherman, with the engine running and the TC hatch closed against small arms fire, was acoustically isolated from everything outside. The Continental R975 9-cylinder radial engine produced somewhere between 400 and 500 horsepower depending on the variant, and it was loud. Not motorcycle loud, not truck loud, machine shop loud, a continuous roar that filled the interior of the tank even with hatches sealed. An infantryman pressed against the tank's side armor, trying to point at a Panzerfaust team 50 feet away, had no means of reaching the man inside. He could pound on the hull. He could climb up and bang on the turret hatch. If the hatch was open and the tank commander had his head up, which meant he was exposed to sniper fire, some communication was possible. In a contested bocage lane, tank commanders who kept their hatches open got shot. So they kept them closed. The tank was blind and deaf to everything outside its own intercom system. The cost was immediate and brutal. An M4 Sherman, moving through a bocage lane, without infantry warning it of threats, was essentially blind past a range of perhaps 50 feet in any direction. Its periscope visibility was limited. Its hull gunner could rarely depress his .30 caliber low enough to engage infantry crouching along the ditch line below the tank's own profile. A German soldier with a Panzerfaust, a weapon that cost roughly 25 Reichsmarks to produce, weighed less than 12 pounds, and could penetrate up to 7 inches of rolled homogeneous armor, could kill a Sherman from less than 100 feet. The weapon had no backblast warning that a tank's crew could detect before firing. The soldier could be behind a hedgerow root ball, prone, invisible from the tank's optics, with a target acquisition time of under 3 seconds. He didn't need training. He needed a gap. The communication gap provided the gap. The 2nd Armored Division's after-action reports from late June 1944 describe losing multiple Shermans to exactly this scenario. The 70th Tank Battalion, operating with the 4th Infantry Division around Saint-Denis in late June, documented repeated incidents where tanks without direct infantry communication were ambushed at ranges that an accompanying infantry squad, if it could have warned the tank crew, would have spotted and reported 20 seconds before the kill shot. 20 seconds is a long time. It is enough time to button up, to pivot the turret, to spray the hedgerow with .30 caliber before the soldier with the Panzerfaust can aim, but only if someone tells you the soldier is there. By the end of June, American tank battalion commanders were trying everything. Some units gave an infantry company headquarters a spare tank radio bolted to a wooden backboard carried by a soldier, but the radio weighed 40-plus pounds, and the soldier was already carrying 60, and the set only worked on the tank net, which meant the infantry battalion commander still couldn't hear it. Some units tried having tankers dismount to confer with infantry officers, which worked fine until someone got killed during the conference. Some units tried hand signals, colored smoke, flag codes, all of which were visible to German observers, who then knew exactly where the command coordination was happening and could drop a mortar round onto it. The solution was worked out not at a headquarters, but at the front, and not by a committee, but by men who were tired of watching Shermans get killed. The precise originator is genuinely uncertain. Multiple units in multiple sectors reached the same answer within days of each other in early July 1944, and the credit is distributed appropriately. But the version that spread, and was documented, and eventually found its way into official use, was this: an EE-8 field telephone handset. A simple black Bakelite handset connected to the tank's existing intercom system by a length of wire mounted in a modified .30 caliber ammunition box on the tank's rear deck, protected by a hinged metal lid that the infantryman could flip open while staying low, press the handset to his ear and mouth, and speak directly to the tank commander inside. The EE-8 field telephone was 1930s technology. It weighed less than 2 pounds. The ammunition box was steel, painted olive drab, roughly the size of a shoebox. The wire was standard intercom wire. The same wire already running through every Sherman between the crewman's helmet-mounted headsets, routed through a small fitting welded onto the tank's rear plate, and spliced into the existing intercom junction box inside the hull. The fitting required a welder with a quarter-inch steel plug and a drill press or a good hand drill. The ammunition box required a hinge, a clasp, and 2 through bolts into the rear plate. The splicing into the intercom junction box required someone who knew which terminals connected to which crewman's circuit, which any tank mechanic who had ever repaired an intercom fault would have known by heart. The whole modification required a combat engineer or a tank mechanic with a welding kit, approximately 2 to 3 hours of work, and scrap materials available on any active battlefield, including the German steel beach obstacles that Sergeant Curtis Cullen had already been welding into hedgerow cutters for the front of Shermans in those same weeks. The same salvage pile that produced the Rhino tank's steel tusks could produce the wire and the box for the tank phone. The battlefield was full of raw materials. American ingenuity was full of the willingness to use them. That was it. That was the fix. That was the innovation that German officers, looking at American combined arms operations in Normandy, could not explain. The German army had superb tanks. It had superb anti-tank guns. It had an officer corps that could not be matched for tactical sophistication. And it could not figure out how American tank crews seemed always to know exactly where the threat was. How the Shermans could be talking to the men outside them. How the combined arms team was actually combining, in real time, at close range, in terrain where that should have been impossible. The answer was a telephone in a tin box. The modification spread the way important combat innovations always spread in armies that trust their sergeants, laterally, by word of mouth, unit to unit, with each battalion making its own slight variation to suit its own tanks and its own infantry partners. The 743rd Tank Battalion, working alongside the 30th Infantry Division since June 14, had their version. So did units of the 2nd Armored Division, the 70th Tank Battalion attached to the 4th Infantry Division, the 741st attached to the 2nd Infantry Division. By the time First Army formalized the modification in official documentation in the weeks following Operation Cobra, hundreds of tanks in the American sector already had the device. No order was required. No approval was sought from Army ground forces in Washington. The Armored Board at Fort Knox, which was the official channel for tank modifications and had a procurement cycle measured in months, was not consulted. Officers from visiting units saw the box, asked about it, went back to their own battalions, and told their mechanics to copy it. That's how it spread. Sergeant to sergeant. Battalion to battalion. The external tank phone appeared in the Pacific Theater almost simultaneously. Marine tankers in the island campaigns, dealing with the same problem in dense jungle, reached the same solution at roughly the same time. A handset, a wire, a box. The specific engineering differed. The logic was identical. The man outside the machine needed to talk to the man inside. German officers interrogated after the war consistently described confusion about American combined arms tactics at the small unit level. They understood American air power. They understood American logistical superiority. What they described as genuinely puzzling was the speed and accuracy of American tactical response at the platoon and company level. How a tank and its accompanying infantry seemed to operate as a single organism, sharing situational awareness, making decisions in seconds that should have taken minutes. Here is what you need to understand about why the Germans could not build this. The German Army's tactical doctrine was, by every serious military historian's assessment, brilliant. Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, mission command, was a system built around the idea that a subordinate officer, given a clear objective and a clear understanding of his commander's intent, should be free to choose his own methods. It produced officers of extraordinary competence, It produced the maneuver warfare that rolled through Poland in September 1939 and through France in May and June of 1940. The panzer commanders of the early war, Guderian, Rommel, Manstein, were products of a culture that genuinely believed a good decision made immediately was worth more than a perfect decision made late. They were right. The results of 1939 and 1940 proved them right, but Auftragstaktik had a specific shape. It was a doctrine built around the officer. The initiative it trusted was officer initiative. The judgment it cultivated was officer judgment. The German military system invested enormous resources in producing the finest company and battalion commanders in the world, and it organized itself around the assumption that those commanders would be the locus of battlefield decision-making. The German non-commissioned officer was competent and experienced, but the architecture of initiative was not designed to reach down to the sergeant or the private first class. The culture, as a 1944 training document from a reserve army headquarters, noted plainly, expected 95% adherence to orders and 5% deviation, deviation being an exception driven by emergency, not a routine empowerment built into every level of the chain. This is not a criticism of the German soldier. Say that plainly. The men of the 2nd SS Panzer and the 1st SS Panzer, who attacked Mortain, were not lacking in courage or competence. They were lacking something structural. Their system had been optimized to execute plans developed by brilliant officers at the top, and it was genuinely excellent at that. When the plan was good, and when communication down the chain was fast, and when the battlefield behaved as the planners expected. When the battlefield did not behave, when a surrounded American lieutenant on a hilltop proved to have better visibility and faster artillery response than the attacking force had anticipated, the German system's corrective mechanisms were slower. The call went up the chain. The approval came back down. In the time that process required, the American observer had already adjusted his fire twice. Moreover, there is a deeper point. Auftragstaktik, in its original Prussian conception, was a doctrine for officers who had been trained for years within a shared professional culture to anticipate each other's intentions. It was not a doctrine for the improvisation of equipment under fire. Trusting a junior officer to choose his own path to the objective was one thing. Trusting a tank maintenance sergeant to weld a shoebox to a tank and reroute the intercom wiring without filing a modification request was a different kind of trust. A trust in unschooled improvisation, in solutions that had not been approved by an engineering board, in fixes that looked wrong on paper but worked perfectly in a Normandy lane. The American Army had that second kind of trust because it was staffed at the enlisted level by civilians who had not been trained to wait for permission. They were farmers and factory workers and gas station attendants who looked at problems the way you look at a broken tractor in a field during harvest. You fix it with what you have, and you fix it now. The German army was not stupid. It was different, and its difference was exactly the wrong shape for the problem it met in Normandy. Pay attention, because this is the hinge of the story. At 3:00 in the morning on August 7, 1944, the German Slevy Panzer Corps, 4 divisions, 300 tanks and assault guns, 26,000 infantry, launched Operation Lüttich at the American 30th Infantry Division. The 30th had fewer than 6,000 riflemen in the line. The German numerical advantage in armor was more than 5-1. Hitler had personally designed the operation, personally selected the objective, and personally issued the order despite warnings from his own generals on the ground, Generaloberst Genther von Kluge among them, that the timing was insufficient and the coordination was not ready. Das Reich struck Mortain directly. By 2:00 a.m., SS infantry were in the streets. By 2:35 a.m., Colonel Hammond Burks, commanding the 120th Infantry Regiment, was issuing emergency orders to defend Hill 314 with whatever companies could be organized. Within the first 2 hours, Das Reich had overrun the American command post at the Hôtel de la Poste, seized the town, and encircled the men of the 2nd Battalion on the hill. 30 officers and men from the 2nd Battalion staff had tiptoed out a back exit as SS troops came in the front, most of them, including Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway, the battalion commander, were captured within hours while trying to slip through German lines. To the north, the 1st SS Panzer, the Liebsten Dart, attacked the 117th Infantry Regiment at St. Barthélemy. The German Northern Pincer needed to drive southwest through the 117th, link up with Das Reich, and then push the combined force west through Juvigny and on to Avranches. The distance from the start line to Avranches was roughly 23 miles. The Germans had to cover it in one night. If they did, Patton's entire Third Army, which had just begun pouring into Brittany, would be cut off. At Hill 314, Lieutenant Weiss and Lieutenant Bartz had survived the initial assault. On the west face of the hill, a penetration by SS troops had reached inside the American perimeter around 1 a.m., close enough that soldiers were throwing grenades by hand and fighting with rifles at arm's length. A brand new 30 caliber machine gun had jammed in the first seconds. Lieutenant Frank Denius, the 3rd forward observer on the hill from the 230th Field Artillery, had pressed himself flat over his radio handset with German soldiers moving 20 feet away, muffling the receiver with his own body to prevent the sound from giving him away. When the SS troops pulled back from the crest before dawn, Denius lifted himself off the radio, verified his grid reference on a crumpled map from the previous unit, and went back to calling fire. This is the thing you have to visualize clearly, because it is the core of the story. The men on Hill 314 were surrounded. They had no food resupply. They had limited water. Their maps were the previous unit's maps, badly marked and crumpled from days of use. Their ammunition was whatever they had carried up the hill. Their communications were their radios, which were dependent on batteries that were being consumed continuously. And their only offensive capability, the only thing they could do to affect the battle, was to look down at the roads below them and call artillery fire onto what they saw. Below them, on the road that runs west from Mortain toward Avranches, Route Nationale 177, the road Hitler had specifically selected as the axis of advance, German armored columns were moving at road speed, Panther tanks, Panzer IVs, half-tracks carrying infantry, horse-drawn artillery batteries following the armor. In daylight, from 314 meters above the valley floor, the column was visible with the naked eye. Every vehicle on that road was a target. Every vehicle on that road had to pass through the artillery fan that Weiss and Bartz could cover. Weiss began transmitting at dawn. He called the fire direction center of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, which was 6 miles to the west behind American lines, connected by radio to batteries of 105 enemy howitzers. He gave grid coordinates. He gave target description, armored column, moving, road march order. He called for fire. The first rounds fell long. He called the correction. The rounds walked back toward the road. He called again. The rounds fell on the center of the column. The column stopped. It could not advance. It could not withdraw without being engaged from the flanks. The men on Hill 314 were surrounded, low on everything, their radios running on diminishing batteries, and they were killing the counterattack that was supposed to save German France. The Germans tried everything. They brought in their own artillery and mortared the crest of the hill for hours at a time. Kampfgruppe, assault elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, launched multiple infantry attacks directly up the slopes of Hill 314. Each time, the German assault troops pressed in close enough to threaten the American perimeter. The forward observers called fire onto the slopes below themselves. The range became short enough to feel the concussive wash of their own shells. At one moment in those days, The closest German forces and the closest American shells were perhaps 75 yards apart, with American soldiers in the gap, and the observer was adjusting the fire by intervals of 50 meters at a time, threading rounds through the space between the attacking Germans and the defending Americans, with a precision that required total concentration and total trust in the gunners 6 miles away. The German response to the artillery was to stop using the roads in daylight. They moved at night. They hid in hedgerows during the day. They tried smoke. They tried deception. They tried attacking in multiple directions simultaneously to split the observer's attention. It worked, partially and temporarily. But there were 3 observers on the hill, and they communicated among themselves, and when one of them had a target, the others could shift. The system was distributed. It could not be killed at one point. By midday on August 7th, the German advance had stalled. The northern pincer of the 1st SS Panzer, attacking toward Juvigny, ran into a 66-man American platoon at the Abbaye Blanche crossroads, equipped with bazookas and direct artillery support, and was stopped by that platoon for long enough to lose its momentum. The crossroads platoon held for hours, with bazooka teams firing from the roadside ditches at lead vehicles, with artillery called in on the approach routes, with the kind of small unit improvised defense that does not appear in pre-written battle plans, because no pre-written battle plan would have put 66 men against an SS Panzer division and expected them to hold. They held. The battle lasted 6 days. The Germans attacked Hill 314 repeatedly. They cut off the defenders completely, let them run short of food and water and ammunition, and on August 10th, 12 C-47 transports flew at 300 feet above the crest under German flak and dropped supply packets. Half the packets landed inside the American perimeter. Half drifted into German hands or into no man's land. The men on the hill divided what they had, redistributed ammunition from their own dead, and kept transmitting. Weiss and Bartz kept calling fire. Denius kept calling fire. When one observer's radio battery died, they transferred to another radio. When a radio was damaged, they used the spare. On August 12, relief troops from the 35th Infantry Division reached the crest. Of the 700 men who had gone up 6 days before, 277 had been killed, wounded, captured, or were missing. The German XV Panzer Corps had lost 120 tanks and assault guns, more than 2/3 of its committed total, to artillery, to P-47 Thunderbolts flying close air support in daylight, and to the unbroken resistance of a division with fewer than 6,000 riflemen facing 26,000 Germans. Hitler's counteroffensive, rather than cutting off Patton's Third Army, had moved the German armored reserve to the western end of the front, just as American forces under Bradley began swinging east and north toward Argentan. By August 24th, the Falaise pocket had closed. Roughly 100,000 German soldiers were encircled. 50,000 were captured. 10,000 were killed. The German army in Normandy ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The root cause of that catastrophe was a counterattack that failed because a hill could not be taken, because 2 lieutenants with a radio could call fire faster than 4 panzer divisions could move. Hold that thought. Because what it reveals goes beyond tactics. The German army was not stupid. Say it plainly, because this kind of history can slide into something condescending if you're not careful. The Wehrmacht's tactical performance in Normandy was often remarkable against enormous material and numerical disadvantage. The units that attacked Hill 314, the 2nd SS Panzer, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier, were among the most experienced and capable formations in the German order of battle. They had fought at Kursk. They had fought at Kharkov. They understood how to use terrain. Their officers were, by any honest measure, superbly trained. What they did not have was a system that trusted the sergeant. Or, more precisely, the trust existed in theory, and it had existed brilliantly in the early war. But by 1944, it had been progressively constrained at the tactical level by communication technology that allowed senior commanders to reach down into platoon decisions, and by an officer culture that had absorbed the lesson, quietly, through the mechanism of consequence rather than doctrine. That initiative was rewarded when it succeeded, and punished when it did not, and the punishment flowed from a command structure that was increasingly centralized in proportion to Hitler's personal micromanagement of the war. The German artillery forward observer existed. German observers were competent. But the German fire support call process, at critical moments in 1944, required more coordination with senior echelons than the American system. German artillery was organized for mass fires directed at the division or corps level, not for the kind of rapid, low-level, observer-driven engagement the Americans had built their field artillery around. A German battery that received a call for fire from a platoon-level observer in a situation that was not anticipated by the day's fire support plan needed to confirm, needed to coordinate, needed to deconflict with other fires in the area. Those requirements were not bureaucratic excess. They were sound operational practice. But in the 4 minutes between Weiss's first call and the first rounds on the Avranches road, the German system would still have been confirming. The American observer had been trusted. The American battery had fired. It was elegant. It trusted the man at the bottom. It worked. Robert Weiss survived the war. He returned to the United States, resumed his education, and built a civilian life. He did not write a widely circulated memoir. He did not become famous in the way that generals become famous. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, the enlisted soldiers, the squad leaders, the platoon leaders who held those rocks for 6 days, mostly went home and went back to work. To farms and factories and small businesses in the Carolinas and Tennessee and Georgia that had produced the 30th Division's recruits. Their service was honored formally. The 30th Infantry Division received a Presidential Unit Citation for Mortain, announced in March 2020, 76 years after the battle. France had awarded the Croix de Guerre long before that. The EE-8 tank phone modification was incorporated into official doctrine after the Normandy campaign. It was standardized, issued as a formal item of equipment, and eventually became so unremarkable a feature of American armored vehicles that later generations of soldiers would not have known there was a time when it did not exist. The problem of tank infantry communication did not end in 1944. It persisted through Korea. It persisted through Vietnam, where Marine tankers improvised their own versions of the rear deck phone box in dense jungle fighting on the same logic their predecessors had used in the bocage. The man outside the machine needed to talk to the man inside. The Army periodically standardized the solution, then removed it as obsolete when better radio technology promised to make it unnecessary, then reissued it when better radio technology proved to require infrastructure that close-quarters fighting never provided. The lesson rhymes through the decades. It is never finally learned because armies are organizations, and organizations forget, and then men die to remind them. The German army's defeat in Normandy was ultimately a strategic failure of Hitler's making. The refusal to reinforce the mobile reserve in the right place before the landings, the refusal to withdraw when withdrawal was still possible, the personal micromanagement of an operation that needed operational flexibility above all else. Blaming the failure of Operation Lüttich entirely on the German communication system would be too simple. But this is also true. Even the finest officers in the finest armored divisions in Normandy could not understand why their careful night movements were being disrupted by artillery so fast that the firing solution appeared to have been computed before they started moving. The observers were that quick. The system was that agile. And the system was agile because it had been built through doctrine, through training, through decades of argument between the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill and the Armored Board at Fort Knox, to trust the man at the front with the authority to act. Return to the hill now, in the copper morning of August 7th, 1944. Lieutenant Robert Weiss, pressed into the French soil in his shallow foxhole, lifts the handset of his Skrar 300 and calls the Fire Direction Center of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. He gives the grid. He gives the target description. He gives the call that says, "I have a target. Armored column. You may shoot when ready." Below him, Das Reich is moving. It has been moving all night. It believes it has avoided observation. It believes the American line is broken, the command post overrun, the defenders cut off and effectively neutralized. It is wrong on all of these things, except the last one. The command post is overrun. The men on the hill are cut off. But they have a radio, and they have a system, and they have the authority to use it without asking anyone's permission. 3 minutes after Weiss transmits the call, 105 mem rounds are falling on the road to Avranches. The column stops. A German commander transmits a report up his chain of command, requesting permission and support and clarification. The American lieutenant makes another adjustment call. The column does not reach Avranches. It does not reach anywhere. By the time the 6 days are over, it does not exist as a coherent force. And the officers who commanded it, brave, skilled, tactically sophisticated by any honest measure, go to their captivity or their graves without ever quite understanding why Americans could always find them. Every time, in every field, behind every hedgerow, the answer was a radio and the authority to use it. The answer was a tin box on the rear deck and the trust that the man pounding on it knew what he saw. The answer was a system that believed at a structural level that the man at the bottom of the hill deserved the authority to call the fire. They kept calling it all the way to the end. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. It means a great deal that you're here. If you found this story worthwhile, please hit the like button below. It takes a second, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about this kind of history. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and ring the bell so you'll know when the next video goes up. We try to cover the unglamorous side of these wars, the problems no one talks about, and the men who solved them without becoming famous for it. Where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. We read every one of them. And if a family member of yours served in Normandy, in the 30th Division, or the 743rd Tank Battalion, or any of the units in this story, tell us about them in the comments below. These men deserve to be remembered by name, and we would be honored to know who they were.